So how long ago was it that we withdrew from Syria? About 3 or 4 years? What's happened since last we visited this story?
We saw what was in September about 1,000 U.S. forces on the ground in Syria. Now, today, it looks like somewhere between 500 and 600. I think our understanding is that of what's remaining of the U.S. forces, it's primarily out of our continuing presence in northeast Syria, as well as some places further south in the Euphrates River Valley for an enduring counter-ISIS mission. The challenge is going to be who's the force that you're working by, with, and through to do that now after the tensions between the U.S. and the Kurds over our withdrawal and the allowance of Turkey's invasion.
So what has really changed, Seth?
Well, a couple of things. One is what we see of groups like the Islamic State right now is not the control of territory anymore. They have switched into a desert campaign. And so what they're doing is sort of traditional guerrilla tactics. They're involved in limited attacks against Syrian forces, some Iranian militia. And this is actually the other thing that's interesting in Syria with the U.S. downsizing in presence. So you can see who has filled the vacuum.
If you go through Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States, who gained from this and who lost from it?
The Russians have gained in the sense of they've kept the Assad regime intact, which was one of their primary objectives to begin with. They now have longer-term power projection capabilities, both maritime at Tartus and also in air at Latakia. The Iranians have also gained key land and air corridors in Syria, where they now have the ability to move fighters, weapons, money from Lebanon through Syria into Iraq, Iran, and even into Afghanistan. So they've got multiple routes in that region.
And Nancy, are we in or out? I mean, we have victors, we're leaving and all of that. Then the next day we read we're sending troops somewhere else in the region.
The U.S. had said they were all leaving, that they were all going to Iraq. And then the Iraqis said, not so fast. They're not going to come here. And they said they can only sort of transit through. And then the U.S. said, actually, our mission now is protecting the oil fields, which is obviously very different than going after ISIS. And then a few weeks after that, we started seeing the return of strike campaigns against ISIS and talk about going after targets. The challenge becomes a legal one, right? Because it's one thing to be there to defeat a terrorist group. It's another to defend ambiguously controlled oil. And I think the sort of mission creeping back in, I think, led to a lot of ambiguity about what the U.S. mission was. Either the U.S. is committed to fighting ISIS or it's not. And I think trying to do a half measure was a win for the Pentagon and that they could keep troops there. But they lost sort of the narrative. And of course, they lost in the process a partnership with the Kurds to some degree.
I think the challenge has been in a government that the U.S. long-term strategy is unclear. Are we staying in Syria? Or are we going? And how do we also tell our partners in the region what we're doing? You know, Brian and I were just in the region recently, and we heard repeatedly from government officials, we don't know what U.S. policy is on a day-to-day basis. So if you're dealing with Syria, you have to assume that the Russians are going to be the long-term power. So when you're trying to calculate who you're going to work with in the region, the U.S. is not a country right now that you can count on for having a clear, coherent, and long-term strategy in the region.
But at the same time, the president has actually been very clear about his expectations and objectives for Syria. He has wanted to withdraw from the beginning, from being on the campaign trail. And I think there's been a disconnect with the national security community that rightfully sees the risk in a rapid withdrawal and has been pushing back against that. And so it's that tension that you've seen played out in the inconsistency of implementation.
I think there's one thing we can say for sure. We're going to be coming back to this story several times before it comes to some conclusion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.